Just across the Mississippi River from modern-day St. Louis, there was once a city bigger than London. Bigger than Paris, a metropolis of tens of thousands of people, with massive earthen pyramids rising above a carefully planned urban landscape. A central plaza, large enough to hold major public gatherings. Evidence of long-distance trade networks stretching thousands of miles across the continent, and a level of social and political organization that historians are still working to fully understand. And most people have never heard of it. Today we're telling the story of Cahokia, the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, a genuine American metropolis that flourished for centuries, then was abandoned before a single European ever set foot on this continent, leaving behind one of the most significant and most overlooked mysteries in North American history. Let's start with where Cahokia was, and just how genuinely massive it actually became, because the scale of this place tends to catch people completely off guard. Cahokia was located in what is now southwestern Illinois, directly across the Mississippi River from the site of modern St. Louis, in a fertile area known as the American Bottom, a wide, rich floodplain formed by the Mississippi River, land that provided exceptionally productive agricultural soil, capable of supporting intensive corn farming on a scale substantial enough to feed a genuinely large urban population. The city began developing around 600 CE, but experienced its most dramatic explosive growth beginning around 1050 CE, in what archaeologists sometimes refer to as a kind of sudden urban Big Bang, a rapid transformation from a modest regional settlement into a sprawling, highly organized metropolis within the span of just a few decades. At its peak, sometime between roughly 1100 and 1200 CE, estimates for Cahokia's population range widely depending on the specific researcher and methodology. But many estimates place the population somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people within the central urban core itself, with some estimates for the broader metropolitan area, including surrounding satellite communities and farmsteads, running considerably higher, into the tens of thousands. To put that in genuine historical context, at this same period in history, around the year 1100 or so, London's population is generally estimated to have been smaller than Cahokia's core population, and Cahokia's broader metropolitan population may well have exceeded that of contemporary Paris as well. This wasn't a small ceremonial village. This was, by any reasonable definition, one of the great cities of the medieval world, sitting right in the middle of the North American continent, centuries before Columbus ever set sail. The physical scale and organization of Cahokia was genuinely remarkable. The city featured over 120 earthen mounds, constructed by hand, basket load by basket load, using an estimated total of over 50 million cubic feet of earth, moved by human labor over the course of the city's construction and expansion. These weren't random piles of dirt. They were carefully engineered structures, built up in distinct layers, serving different specific purposes, including massive platform mounds that supported important buildings and residences for the city's elite, and other mounds believed to have served as burial sites for important individuals. The largest of all these structures, known today as Monks Mound, named for a group of Trappist monks who briefly lived near the site in the early 19th century, remains remarkably the largest prehistoric earthen structure in the entire Americas. Monks Mound covers an area of roughly 14 acres at its base, larger than the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza, and rises in 4 distinct terraced levels to a height of exceeding 100 feet. Archaeological evidence suggests that a massive wooden structure once stood atop its summit, likely serving as a residence or ceremonial building for the city's most important ruler or rulers. Positioned dramatically to overlook the entire city spread out below, Cahokia's urban planning extended well beyond just its mounds. At the heart of the city lay a massive central plaza, a deliberately flattened, carefully leveled open area covering approximately 50 acres, believed to have served as a gathering space for large public ceremonies, feasts, and quite possibly for a competitive game archaeologists have identified evidence of called Chunky, a game involving rolling a carved stone disc and throwing spears to predict where it would eventually stop. A game so popular and culturally significant that it appears to have spread across huge portions of North America in the centuries following Cahokia's rise, with variations of it being played by numerous different indigenous nations across the continent, long after Cahokia itself had faded, perhaps. One of the most genuinely fascinating discoveries at Cahokia is a massive circular arrangement of wooden posts that archaeologists have nicknamed Woodhenge, an intentional callback to England's famous Stonehenge, because of its remarkably similar apparent function. Woodhenge consisted of large wooden posts arranged in a precise circle, and careful archaeological and astronomical analysis has demonstrated that specific posts within this circle align accurately with the position of the rising sun on the solstices and equinoxes. This wasn't decorative. This was a sophisticated, deliberately engineered astronomical calendar, allowing Cahokia's leaders and religious authorities to precisely track important seasonal transitions. Information that would have carried enormous practical importance for coordinating agricultural planting and harvest cycles, as well as likely holding deep religious and ceremonial significance for the timing of important public rituals and gatherings. Throughout the year, Cahokia's influence and connections extended across an enormous portion of the North American continent. Archaeological excavations at the site have recovered materials and finished goods originating from remarkably distant regions, including copper from the area around Lake Superior, hundreds of miles to the north, mica sourced from the Appalachian Mountains to the east, and marine shell material originating from the Gulf Coast, hundreds of miles to the south. This tells us that Cahokia sat at the center of an extensive, well-established long-distance trade and exchange network, connecting communities across a massive portion of the North American continent. Centuries before European contact would later disrupt and reshape those indigenous trading relationships entirely. The social and political organization required to plan, build, and sustain a city on this scale would have been genuinely sophisticated. Evidence from burial sites at Cahokia, including one particularly significant and much-studied burial mound, reveals clear indications of a highly stratified society, with distinct differences in status, wealth, and ceremonial treatment visible in how different individuals were buried. One especially notable burial, often referred to by archaeologists as the Birdman burial, found an individual laid to rest on a bed of thousands of carefully arranged marine shell beads, accompanied by other high-status ceremonial objects, strongly suggesting this was a person of very high social and possibly political or religious rank within Cahokian society. Evidence of a genuinely complex social hierarchy governing this large, organized urban population, so we have a genuinely impressive picture. A massive, carefully planned city, home to tens of thousands of people, featuring monumental earthen architecture on a scale unmatched anywhere else in North America, a sophisticated astronomical calendar system, extensive long-distance trade connections spanning much of the continent, and clear evidence of complex social and political organization. And yet by around 1350 CE, roughly 2 centuries after its explosive growth began, Cahokia had been substantially depopulated, and by the 1400s, the city that had once been the largest metropolis in North America had been essentially abandoned entirely, its great mounds left standing empty, gradually being reclaimed by prairie grasses and forest. Centuries before any European explorer would ever arrive to see what had once stood there. This is the central mystery of Cahokia, and much like the other great collapse stories we've explored, historians and archaeologists have proposed several overlapping explanations, generally favoring, once again, a combination of compounding factors rather than any single dramatic cause. The first major factor commonly cited is environmental strain and resource depletion. Supporting a population of this size for multiple centuries would have required an enormous sustained supply of timber, both for construction of buildings and palisade walls and for fuel. Some researchers have proposed that centuries of intensive logging in the immediate vicinity of Cahokia may have gradually led to significant deforestation of the surrounding landscape, which in turn could have contributed to increased flooding and erosion problems in the American bottom floodplain that the city's agricultural economy depended on so heavily, potentially undermining the very agricultural productivity that had allowed the city to grow so large in the first place. The second major factor involves climate change, specifically evidence for a period of increased flooding, and in other periods, drought conditions affecting the wider Mississippi River region during the centuries of Cahokia's decline, part of broader climate fluctuations that affected various regions across North America during this general era. For a city whose enormous population depended heavily on reliable, large-scale corn agriculture within the Mississippi floodplain, significant disruptions to normal flooding and rainfall patterns, whether from increased catastrophic flooding events or from periods of drought, could have placed severe strain on the food supply necessary to sustain a population of Cahokia's substantial size. The third major factor that some researchers have proposed involves internal, political and social instability. Evidence at the site, including the construction of a massive wooden defensive palisade wall surrounding the central ceremonial precinct of the city sometime during its history, suggests that Cahokia experienced periods of genuine internal tension or external threat serious enough to warrant significant defensive fortification. A notable contrast to the city's earlier, apparently less defensively fortified phases. Some archaeologists have proposed that as environmental and resource pressures mounted, internal political tensions, potentially including competition between different elite factions within Cahokian society, or growing social unrest among the general population as resources became more strained, may have contributed to gradual social fragmentation and eventual, sustained population decline and outmigration. A fourth factor worth mentioning, though it remains more speculative and debated among researchers, involves the broader regional political landscape shifting over these centuries, similar to patterns seen in other regions after a major population center goes into decline. As Cahokia's central authority and economic dominance weakened, whether from environmental strain, internal instability, or some combination of both, surrounding and more distant communities across the wider Mississippian cultural world. A broad network of related mound-building societies that extended across much of the American Southeast and Midwest during this general period may have become less dependent on Cahokia specifically as a central hub, gradually redirecting trade relationships, political alliances, and population elsewhere, further accelerating Cahokia's relative decline, even if it wasn't necessarily the sole or primary original cause. What's particularly striking about Cahokia's story, when you place it alongside other great historical collapses we've discussed, from the Maya to the Minoans to Great Zimbabwe, is just how familiar this same fundamental pattern turns out to be, appearing again and again across wildly different continents. Cultures and centuries of sophisticated, prosperous society reaches an impressive peak of population and organization, places increasing strain on its own environmental foundation in the process of sustaining that growth, and then experiences a period of environmental and climatic stress that its already strained systems struggle to absorb, compounded by internal social and political pressures that gradually erode the cohesion holding a large, complex society together until population and organized central authority both decline, sometimes gradually, sometimes more rapidly, leaving behind monumental architecture as the primary lasting evidence of a genuine metropolis that once thrived there. It's important to say clearly, as with the Maya story we discussed earlier, that Cahokia's decline did not mean the disappearance of indigenous peoples from this region, or the disappearance of the broader Mississippian cultural tradition that Cahokia had been part of. Mississippian mound-building societies continued to exist and flourish in various forms across other parts of the American Southeast for centuries afterward. And the descendants of the peoples connected to this broad Mississippian cultural world continued their traditions in various forms, some of which persisted right up until the devastating disruptions caused by European colonization many generations later. What specifically declined and was ultimately abandoned was Cahokia itself, as the singular, massive, dominant metropolis it had briefly, remarkably been. Cahokia's rediscovery and eventual recognition by the wider world has its own somewhat frustrating history, not entirely unlike what we saw with Great Zimbabwe, though playing out somewhat differently. For a considerable period after European settlers began encountering the impressive earthen mounds scattered across the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys, a persistent and deeply flawed theory took hold among many prominent 19th century American thinkers, sometimes called the mound builder myth, which held that these clearly sophisticated monumental earthworks simply could not have been built by the ancestors of the Native American peoples that European settlers were, during this exact same period, actively displacing and dispossessing of their land. Instead, various theories credited these mounds to a supposed lost race of ancient mound builders, alternatively theorized to be Vikings, ancient Israelites, or some other vanished and non-indigenous population, a convenient historical fiction that, much like the false theories surrounding Great Zimbabwe, served the political and ideological purposes of the era, making it considerably easier to rationalize the ongoing displacement and mistreatment of Native American peoples if one simultaneously denied that, Their own ancestors were capable of the very monumental achievements sitting plainly, visible across the American landscape. It would take patient, dedicated archaeological work throughout the 20th century, alongside a broader and long overdue shift in how American scholarship approached indigenous history, to firmly and definitively establish what the physical evidence had honestly always clearly indicated, that Cahokia, and the broader Mississippian mound building tradition it was part of, was unquestionably built by the ancestors of Native American peoples. A genuinely remarkable achievement of indigenous North American civilization using sophisticated urban planning, monumental engineering, and complex social organization, entirely independent of any outside influence. Today, the site of Cahokia is preserved as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the most historically and archaeologically significant locations in all of North America. And yet it remains, even now, remarkably unfamiliar to most Americans, many of whom have simply never learned that one of the largest cities in the medieval world once stood not in Europe, not in Asia, not in Mesoamerica, but right there in the American Midwest. Within sight of where the modern Gateway Arch now rises over St. Louis, a stone's throw in the grand sweep of history, from where tens of thousands of people once gathered in a 50-acre plaza, watched the solstice sun rise precisely between the wooden posts of Woodhenge, and looked up at a hand-built earthen mound taller than many medieval European cathedrals. In a city that for a few remarkable centuries was genuinely one of the great urban centers of the entire medieval world, before quietly, gradually, fading back into the prairie grass, and very nearly fading from memory entirely.